Before we begin today, I'd like to acknowledge that I come from you, from what always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that same respect to any Indigenous people or First Nations people watching today. Most of our first interactions with Shakespeare are in a senior English class, reading a no-fear Shakespeare, Cambridge or other accompaniment, drawling through some edgy teenage boy reading for Romeo or Macbeth, and his equally bored female counterpart, and a super out of place and laughably enthusiastic theatre kid reading lines with just a little bit too much excitement. But you've been lied to. Your first interaction with a full-length, full fantasy Shakespearean story was probably on the couch at 2 p.m. on a Sunday after you've been to Blockbuster with Dad to get that 5 for $15 deal. I remember. My name's Ellie, and welcome to my first ever video essay. As you can probably tell from the title, today I'm going to be talking to you about Shakespearean movies for teens and kids, and why they are so important. I hope that I touch on some of your childhood favourites. I'm definitely touching on some of mine. And I hope that you enjoy this video as much as I enjoyed making it. We all have these preconceived notions of Shakespeare, mostly established by an uninspired school curriculum, their inaccessibility or other social forces, that they're boring, hard to understand, irrelevant or outdated. Well, for a self-confessed Shakespeare nerd, these notions are complete rubbish. For many, they're true. Most of my peers don't like Shakespeare simply because of how it's been introduced to them. And thus, today I am going to be shining a light on adaptations of Shakespeare in children and teen films, and why they are so important to be explicitly taught as such. Take a shot every time I say Shakespeare. I've chosen 3 films that I personally consumed when I was younger, and films that I believe to be good representation of these stories for a modern audience and context. These being The Lion King, inspired, well loosely, by Hamlet, the feminist icon Kat Stratford in 10 Things I Hate About You, inspired by Taming of the Shrew, and finally, She's the Man, inspired by Twelfth Night, and where I first learned what a tampon was. Of course, there are more films that have been influenced by Shakespeare. Nearly any Hollywood classic story could be linked back to Shakespeare in some manner, but I want to discuss those that I believe to be the most influential in bringing Shakespeare back to cultural awareness, or those that introduce younger audiences to Shakespeare. And no, I will not be talking about Romeo and Juliet, for spiritual reasons. I'll start with what I think to be the least influence out of all of these films, although what is probably the most popular, The Lion King. Yes, this childhood favourite was inspired by the tragedy of Prince Hamlet. You're probably thinking, Ellie, how the fuck? But mark me and lend thy serious hearing to what I shall unfold. I'll give a general overview of each play for those that haven't seen it or read it or aren't familiar, and hopefully you'll be able to see the similarities for yourself. The play Hamlet, written around 1599, is centred upon the tragic life and death of Prince Hamlet of Denmark, whose father, King Hamlet, is murdered by Claudius, his brother, and Claudius marries the queen and becomes king. Horatio, Hamlet's friend, sees the ghost of Hamlet's father and tells Hamlet, who promptly heeds every word that his father says, and sets out to revenge his death. But he is a philosopher, and spends the entire play procrastinating killing his uncle, although entertainingly. Madness ensues, his love Ophelia is driven insane by Hamlet's strange actions and drowns. Everyone dies, and the iconic line, "Good night, sweet prince," is born. You may or may not understand the similarities for yourself, so I'll set them out for you. Prince Hamlet is Simba, who, after the death of his father, King Hamlet / Mufasa, is visited by his ghost, shown to him by Rafiki / Horatio, who tells him of his greatness and inspires him to avenge his death. Scar/Claudius is now king, and Simba must rely on the help of his friends Timon and Pumbaa, or Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, to help him on his journey. He falls in love with Nala/Ophelia, and while their love does not end in madness and death in the film, it serves to move the plot forward, just as Ophelia does in the play. Eventually, Scar and his minions are overthrown and order is restored. While The Lion King does not end in nearly as much tragedy and violence as the play does, the similarities, in my opinion, are undeniably there. This whole argument admittedly sounds a little bit like a conspiracy, but it's important to recognise these similarities so we can see just how versatile Shakespeare's texts are. They can be translated into the African savannah in a film for children and still keep their central themes and deliver the same message to the audience about family, loyalty, royalty, and friendship. Next is my personal favourite and what radicalised me as a child, 10 Things I Hate About You, inspired by Taming of the Shrew. Taming of the Shrew, in my opinion, is one of the most poorly aged Shakespearean texts, and is definitely a product of its time. While after seeing this staged as a production and reading it, I have an understanding of how it can be interpreted to fit a modern set of beliefs and values, at first glance it is undeniably problematic, although it does have some of the best slapstick and comedic roles in all of Shakespeare. The play centres around Caterina and her young sister Bianca, two noble women of Padua, Italy. Their father decrees that the maidenly Bianca cannot be married until the older of the pair is married, Caterina. Slight problem. Caterina is a shrew and has scared away any suitors within miles of the city, until Petruchio comes along and vows to tame the shrew, and he does so through manipulation, starving her, and basically being a giant dick, until she is tamed. Bianca's suitors go through a very Shakespearean ordeal of cross-dressing as tutors to the sisters in order to win the favour of Bianca. Lucentio and Bianca eventually fall in love and all is well for her. Now to 10 Things. This interpretation, released in 1999 to generally positive reviews, is a beautiful example of how modernizations for a younger audience can be done, and done well. The film is set at Padua High and centres around Cat Stratford. If you didn't know, Stratford upon Avon is where Shakespeare was born. That's where her last name comes. Another theme that I've noticed in a lot of these recontextualizations of Shakespeare, a lot of them will somehow use the name Stratford either as a place name or a last name. Cute little nod to Shakespeare. Anyway, back to Cat. She's a badass Sylvia Plath reading grunge feminist. And we have Bianca, her girly, hyper-feminine and super fucking annoying until the end sister. Their father rules that Bianca can't date anyone unless Cat is dating. This proves to be a major issue for Cameron, who is an adaptation of Lucentio, who's trying to bag Bianca. Patrick Verona, the typical bad boy, comes to Padua High from the distant land down under, and gets caught up in a plot for Bianca's love, involving Patrick being paid to date Cat so that Cameron can date Bianca. Patrick wears Cat down, but not in an abusive way as he does in the play, in a way that Cat finds endearing, like when he sings to her on the bleachers or follows her to a concert in the coolest club I've ever seen. Seriously. The money that I would pay for someone to build a club like that in Brisbane. Eventually, they find that they have genuine feelings for each other, only for Cat to find out that Patrick was paid to date her. Until, in one of the most iconic scenes from a teen film of all time, Cat delivers a poem in the style of one of Shakespeare's sonnets to her English class about how much she hates, or doesn't hate, Patrick. He buys her a guitar to say sorry and all is well. The film follows a more typical rom-com structure compared to the play of a slow and unconventional descent into romantic relations. Something bad happens and they break apart, and then something good happens and they come back for a happily ever after. My favourite character, other than Cat, of course, is Michael, because he is sort of a stand-in for all of the foolish servants that deliver some of the most iconic comic relief roles in Shakespeare, like Biondello, Grumio, or Gremio. Also, I couldn't really decipher who Miss Perky was supposed to be, but she is an absolute sexual icon, and I'm always down for a bit of Alison Janney in my life, even if this character is super weird. What I love most about this interpretation of a somewhat outdated text is how it showed a generation of young girls that it's okay to be a strong woman. The amount of times I've heard a sentence or something along the lines of "I'm a feminist because of Cat" from 10 Things, or "Cat's my idol," is innumerable, seriously. Although Patrick was initially paid to date her and uninterested at the beginning, he finds that he truly does love her, and by extension showed this generation of women that you will find someone to love you for being strong, no matter your orientation. It represented them both as sort of social outcasts who find each other, matching each other's intellect, and come together, despite social norms and circumstance, which, if you ever get the chance to see a modern production of Shrew, is a theme that carries through. They are often depicted as two intellectuals playing a strange game of courtship and eventually finding love in their own little strange way, rather than having a gender power imbalance or an abusive relationship. And I can't help but think this modern interpretation of their relationship was influenced by Patrick and Cat in 10 Things. I think this is one of the best and most palatable recontextualizations for the new generation, who at first would otherwise write off this text at first glance for being outdated and irrelevant. Plus, the costumes are so good. Just so good. And the soundtrack. This movie is basically like any 90s fashion or music fan's dream, and Heath Ledger is at peak dreamboat condition. Next, we have another 2000s classic, She's the Man. This is another film in the same vein as 10 Things, a Shakespeare set in a very Y2K high school in a movie recontextualized to appeal to teens. It's based off of 12th Night, a Shakespearean comedy involving lots of cross-dressing, yellow stockings, and big bisexual energy. Viola washes ashore in Illyria after a shipwreck, and, assuming her twin brother Sebastian has drowned, tries to find work as a strapping young page boy. She is hired by Duke Orsino, who is in love and trying to woo Olivia, who after the death of her brother has vowed to stay in mourning for 7 years and receive no male visitors. I wish I could do the same. She falls in love with Violet, dressed as a man, and Violet falls in love with Orsino. Sebastian is eventually found, and Olivia falls in love with him, and happily ever after. Lots of confusing cross-dressing, buffoonish servants, and did I mention big bisexual energy? My favourite thing to do when I read a play for the first time, especially a Shakespeare, is to point out which of the roles would be the role that I would love to play. And you are looking at someone whose life would not be complete until they play Malvolio. Anyway, She's the Man is an adaptation of this story, released in 2006 with an iconic lead cast, including Amanda Bynes and Channing Tatum. We set our story at Cornwall High, where soccer enthusiast Viola is rejected from playing on the boys' team simply because she's a girl. Her brother, Sebastian, a musician who's gotten a gig in London, asks Viola to cover for her for 2 weeks. She takes the opportunity to pose as him so she can play soccer for Illyria and beat Cornwall. She does this by masquerading as a boy and, as I said before, introduced a young me to a feminine product to which I was very unfamiliar and very confused as to why it was so funny that she put one up her nose. Her roommate, Duke Orsino, Illyria's soccer star, befriends Sebastian, or Viola, after seeing that she is very popular with the ladies. In science class we meet Olivia, who falls in love with Sebastian while Duke is trying to woo her. Getting a bit confusing, I hope you're following along. At this time we also meet Malcolm Festi, who is a combination of both Malvolio and Festi, a servant and a clown respectively, who bumble around and provide comic relief in the play, like Malcolm does. Side note, I had a PE teacher in grade 7 that was literally like the soccer coach in this film. Accent, little earring, everything. Viola and Sebastian are exposed to Illyria when he makes an early return, macks on Olivia, pisses off Duke, and plays in Viola's soccer game. Viola comes to save the day by winning the game, explaining everything, and telling everyone the truth about who she is. Eventually, Viola and Duke fall in love, Olivia goes to the debutante ball with the real Sebastian, and all is well. This film holds some really good female representation for a film made in the 2000s. Viola is portrayed as tomboyish. She rejects her mother's insistence on her attending the debutante ball and stands up to the soccer coach when he says that she can't try out for the boys' team. It also follows the original story of Twelfth Night quite close to the source material, and has some fun little Easter eggs for fans of the OG, like Cesario's Pizza Company, Duke wearing a ring as a necklace, and Malvolio the spider. This film holds some great female representation, especially for a 2000s film. Viola is portrayed as tomboyish, but still undeniably cool, as she rejects her mother's insistence on her attending the debutante ball, and stands up to her soccer coach when he says that she can't try out for the boys' team. It also follows the original story of Twelfth Night quite close to the source material, and has some fun little Easter eggs for fans of the original, like Cesario's Pizza Company, Duke wearing a ring around his neck, or Malvolio the spider. The play doesn't end with Viola flashing her boobs to a stadium. This is a brilliant ending. Not realistic, but fun nevertheless. This film is one that often receives surprise reactions when I tell people it's a Shakespeare, even though it's written in the opening credits, because it's adapted so well. Again, I have very similar things to say about this as I do about 10 Things, because they are fundamentally very similar films, being Shakespeare's recontextualized into a Y2K high school. And because they are so similar, we can see how truly universal Shakespeare's depiction of human life and of emotion really is. So much so that they can be adapted into a commercially viable setting at the time, being teen films set in high schools, and remain close to the source material while reflecting the interests, beliefs, and values of a new generation. TLDR! While we may not know it, Shakespearean stories are all around us. Little bits and pieces of language, plot lines, and tropes originated or popularized by the bard circumvent so much of our literature and media, and serve to show how both accurate and beautiful Shakespeare's accounts of human nature were, and how in a world that so often discounts the value of theatre, especially classical theatre, that we can continue to tell and renew these timeless stories for generations to come. Even Romeo and Juliet had its fans. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end of this video, I am very grateful. I hope you enjoyed hearing me blabber on about a subject that I'm very passionate about, and I hope you got something out of this video, learned something new. Maybe I inspired you to revisit a childhood classic or go read a new Shakespeare play. Who knows? But I really hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did and you would like to see more content, don't forget to subscribe down below. But if you'd also like to follow me down on Instagram, my username's in the description. Keep up with all my fun projects, see what I eat for breakfast, I don't know, whatever you want to follow me for. And I will leave you with a Shakespearean quote of the day. This one's from The Taming of the Shrew, spoken by Katerina, and one of my most favourite Shakespeare quotes of all time. If I be waspish, best beware my sting.